In the summer of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached its cruel equilibrium. Every daylight raid by the U.S. 8th Air Force brought more losses, more telegrams to American families, and yet, more resolve. From the airfields of East Anglia, the bombers rose like slow, silvery whales, each loaded with about 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of high explosive, bound for the heart of Hitler's industrial Germany. Their lifeline, slender and fragile, was a handful of fighter escorts still too few for the skies they had to defend. The mission for August 17, 1943, was a bold experiment in precision bombing, a double strike on the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Intelligence promised to cripple the Reich's war machine by targeting what General Arnold called the single point of failure in the German armory. But it meant flying deeper than any previous raid, beyond the reach of easy return, across 600 miles of hostile airspace. The men knew the odds. At Oro 600, the 8th Fighter Command launched a covering force of P-47 Thunderbolts and, on some legs, limited P-38 Lightnings, not P-51s at this date, faster, hard-hitting, and blessed with as much range as drop tanks then allowed. Among them was Captain Jack Carr, 28, of the 4th Fighter Group. Texas-born, son of a rancher, Carr had already survived 12 missions. He carried in his jacket a small photograph of his wife in Midland and a promise he never expected to keep. "I'll make it home before Christmas." That morning, the airfield was shrouded in a fine gray mist. Ground crews worked in silence, adjusting drop tanks, checking oxygen valves. Carr's crew chief, Corporal Lenny McBride, tapped the fuselage of his Thunderbolt and said quietly, "She'll bring you back, Captain." Carr nodded but didn't answer. He had watched too many planes return without their pilots to believe in luck. At 800 hours, the flight assembled. 8 P-47s of the 335th Squadron, call sign, Red Leader. Their orders: intercept any Luftwaffe fighters massing near Regensburg and draw them away from the bomber stream. A screen of iron around the bombers, the briefing officer had called it. In reality, it was a thin veil of courage stretched across the largest air armada Europe had ever seen. They crossed the channel, in Finger 4 elements stepped up in height, the sun rising at their backs. Over France, the radio crackled with updates from the bomber groups, flak heavy over Nancy, scattered resistance near Metz. The first hour passed in uneasy quiet. Then, as they approached the Bavarian border, the sky began to move. Out of the haze to the east came the black specks, dozens of them, climbing in disciplined waves. Messerschmitt, BF 101s with their yellow noses gleaming in the sunlight, flanked by the heavier Focke-Wulf 190s. Carr counted, swore softly under his breath, and keyed the radio. "Control, this is Red Leader. We've got 60 plus, high at 2 o'clock, heading in fast." There was no reply. The frequency drowned in static. Carr switched to the squadron channel. "All red units, tighten up. We're not running. We're buying time for the heavies." The words were calm, almost casual, but every man knew what they meant. 8 against 60 was no equation of tactics. It was defiance turned into action. They broke formation, splitting into pairs, the Finger 4 pattern that gave them their only chance of survival. The first contact came at 21,000 feet. Tracers arced through the sunlight, yellow and white, like beads on invisible strings. The Thunderbolts rolled, dived, and clawed for altitude again, engines screaming at full boost. In the first 5 minutes, Lieutenant Harry Doyle took a cannon hit in his wing and went down smoking. His last words on the radio were almost serene. "Tell Jack I got one before I bought it." Carr saw the flash of Doyle's chute, then the quick blossom of fire as the wreck hit a field below. The rest had no time to mourn. Over the Danube Valley, the air turned into a storm of metal. The German fighters pressed their advantage, attacking in tight, rotten pairs, using the sun to blind the Americans. Carr's section looped through the contrails, twisting and firing at silhouettes that vanished as soon as they appeared. By 09:45, the sky was a boiling canvas of vapor and flame. The bombers, far above, lumbered on toward Regensburg, their crews focused on holding formation and the bomb run, while below a small escort fight bled the interceptors away. A handful of escorts trading their lives for the safety of hundreds. Carr's voice stayed steady on the radio. "Keep them chasing us. The bombers are priority." Every second they held the Germans was another second the B-17s gained. It wasn't heroism in the moment, just grim arithmetic. As his fuel gauge dipped below half, Carr banked left and saw the impossible, a wall of Messerschmitts reforming for another pass. He knew then that they were surrounded. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "the sky belongs to whoever stays in it. Let's make sure that's us." The flight plunged into the sunlight again. At 09:58, the first bombs fell on Regensburg. The Luftwaffe command center there lost contact with its interceptor units for 7 crucial minutes, just long enough for the Americans to deliver their strike. And in those same 7 minutes, 8 pilots fought 60 men to a standstill. At midday, the wind over Bavaria carried the bitter tang of cordite and oil. What had begun as a planned escort mission had dissolved into a running aerial brawl stretching 30 miles across the Danube Valley. The radio net was fractured, the call signs scattered. The Americans had lost 4 of their 8 Thunderbolts. What remained was a loose trio of survivors: Captain Jack Carr, Lieutenant Ed Simmons, and the quiet Minnesotan, Lieutenant Paul Reiner, each flying alone, each trusting the others were still alive somewhere in the blinding haze. Carr's instrument panel trembled. A 20-millimeter shell had shattered his canopy minutes earlier. Wind howled through the cockpit, tugging at his oxygen mask. The altimeter needle wavered between 17 and 18,000 feet. Through the fractured glass, he caught a flicker, 3 Bf-109s climbing from his left. He rolled the Thunderbolt inverted and dove. Gravity did the work his engine could no longer promise. The R-2800 Double Wasp's roar became a scream. Behind him, tracers laced the air like fiery stitching across a gray quilt. Carr's left hand gripped the throttle. His right flicked the gun switch. 8 .50 caliber Brownings answered in a burst that tore through one Messerschmitt's radiator. The German pilot bailed out, his parachute opening like a ghost above the valley. Below, Reiner and Simmons found each other by chance. 2 bolts low over Ingolstadt, Simmons muttered, catching a flash of red trim on Reiner's tail. They flew in silence, conserving fuel, trying to rejoin Carr. The Luftwaffe's advantage was doctrine: attack in pairs, dive from the sun, disengage before the Americans could climb. But that day, the Germans had misjudged. They believed they faced a full escort wing. Their radar at Augsburg had multiplied the contacts in error. Dozens of fighters were hunting ghosts. Carr sensed it before the analysts ever would. Between the attacks there were gaps, moments when the sky cleared, when the Germans regrouped too far, waiting for orders. That was the seam he needed. At 10:15, with fuel running low, Carr rallied what was left. "Red leader to any unit still up. We turn east now. Hit them before they reset." 2 voices answered, Reiner's calm baritone, Simmons's crackling drawl. 3 planes against more than 50 still airborne. Yet momentum, like weather, could shift in an instant. They climbed into the glare, contrails etching a pale spiral behind them. Carr's Thunderbolt leveled at 23,000 feet. Sun above, horizon below. For one measured breath, the world held still. Then they struck. From that height, the P-47's dive speed and rugged frame were their salvation. The trio tore through the German formation before it could scatter. Reiner caught a 190 broadside. His guns flared, and the Focke-Wulf burst into flame. Simmons rolled out, pulling hard left, cutting another from its wingman. The Americans didn't linger. They dove, climbed, and dove again, never staying long enough to be cornered. For the first time that day, the Luftwaffe wavered. Pilots shouted over radio circuits in 6 dialects, demanding bearings and orders. Their precision unraveled under the chaos of surprise. Carr saw opportunity in the disorder. He dove once more, his guns raking a twin-engine Bf-110 heavy fighter that had joined the chase. The German craft disintegrated mid-air. A second later, his own plane shuddered. Return fire punched holes through the right wing. He pulled back, breath ragged, oxygen line torn loose. As he leveled out, Simmons' voice crackled through static. "Jack, they're breaking off. The bombers are clear." Carr glanced upward. Through the haze, dozens of contrails stretched eastward, B-17s continuing south toward North Africa after striking Regensburg. They were intact. Against all logic, the escort had held. By 1100 hours, the remaining Thunderbolts turned west, low on ammunition and fuel. The Germans, now outnumbering no one, disengaged to refuel. The battle had lasted barely an hour and a half, but its effects would echo through both air forces. At Debden, intelligence officers would later note a curious statistic. Only 3 American fighters returned, yet bomber losses that day were far lower than predicted. The Luftwaffe, for the first time, had been stalled by a smaller, tougher enemy that refused to yield. Carr's logbook entry for August 17th was laconic. Escorted bombers to Regensburg. Heavy opposition, mission complete. He did not mention the 60. He did not mention Doyle. He simply wrote, "The sky held." By late afternoon, the European sky had turned the color of pewter. The 3 surviving Thunderbolts limped westward, each wounded in its own way. Reiner's canopy cracked, Simmons's engine coughing from a damaged supercharger, Carr's fuselage torn by cannon holes that whistled with every dive. The channel was still 2 hours away, and the men knew that even if the Germans didn't return, the fuel gauges might finish what enemy fire had begun. Carr flew in silence. The adrenaline of battle had cooled into a quiet, deliberate focus. Below, the land stretched in brown and green patches, fields threaded with roads and smoke columns. His right glove was stiff with blood, where shards of perspex had cut his hand. He flexed his fingers, testing control. The Thunderbolt answered sluggishly but steady. They were almost clear of Germany when a new shadow crossed the sun. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s, trailing contrails, closing fast from above. The Germans had regrouped. Carr keyed the radio. 2 bogies, high 6, stay low and keep moving. Reiner's voice came back. It copy, Jack. No altitude left to play with. They were out of options. The trio had no fuel to fight, no speed to run. Carr banked left, climbing barely 100 feet, forcing the enemy to overshoot. The first German dove too steeply, guns blazing. Carr rolled hard right, and the tracers passed inches from his tail. In the next breath, Simmons fired, short, controlled bursts that struck the 190's wing root. The fighter disintegrated, tumbling in the flame through the afternoon haze. But the second German closed on Reiner. Carr saw it happen in slow motion. The burst of cannon fire, the Thunderbolt's right wing shearing away, the black plume as Reiner's plane spiraled down. "I'm out," Reiner said quietly, almost whispering. "Tell my mother I flew home." Then the line went dead. Carr's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing. The last 190 swung wide, circling to make another pass. Carr pushed his throttle forward until the needle trembled in the red. The R-2800 roared. He pulled the Thunderbolt vertical, straight into the sun. The German followed, blinded by glare. Carr half-rolled, came down behind him, and squeezed the trigger. The Browning spat fire, and the 190 exploded into a cascade of metal and vapor. Silence returned. Below, only 2 Thunderbolts remained, Carr and Simmons. The radio was filled with the sound of the wind. "If fuel's gone," Simmons muttered. "Then we glide," Carr answered. They crossed into France at treetop height. Carr's map was gone, burned away in the cockpit fire. He followed the curve of a river, heading west by instinct and faith. Near Dijon, Simmons's engine sputtered once and died. Carr watched him bail out, chute opening just above the forest. He wanted to circle, to mark the spot, but his own fuel light blinked red. At 1620 hours, somewhere over the Loire Valley, Carr's Thunderbolt gave its last breath. The propeller slowed, then stopped. The sudden quiet felt immense after hours of engine noise. He trimmed the nose down, scanning for open ground. A field appeared through the haze, a thin strip of wheat. He aimed for it. The landing was less a touchdown than a crash softened by luck. The landing gear tore off. The plane skidded 200 yards and came to rest in silence. For a moment, he sat motionless, surrounded by the ticking of cooling metal. Then he unbuckled, dragged himself from the cockpit, and fell into the grass. For the first time all day, he noticed the scent of the earth, burnt oil, wheat, and summer wind. That night, Carr was found by a French farmer who spoke no English but recognized the roundel on his flight suit. The man hid him in a cellar beneath his barn. Carr drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. His wounds fevered, his dreams filled with roaring engines and faces that dissolved in fire. He was alive, but the war wasn't finished with him. Weeks later, when Allied forces swept through France, intelligence officers found him, gaunt, limping, clutching a rusted dog tag he had carried from the wreckage. When they asked what had happened over Regensburg, he gave only one answer. "We did our job. The bombers made it home." He never spoke of the 60, never mentioned the moment when the sky seemed to end, but the records told the rest. On that August day, Luftwaffe archives logged dozens of aircraft lost or damaged in the Regensburg sector, far more than expected, an anomaly they couldn't explain. American losses in the bomber stream were significantly lower than predicted. Somewhere in those numbers lay the truth of what 8 men had done. By the time the autumn rains swept across East Anglia, Captain Jack Carr had returned to his unit. He was thinner now, the sharp Texan humor tempered by silence. The ground crews, who once greeted him with teasing bets about how many kills he'd claim, saluted wordlessly as he walked across the tarmac. In his absence, the 8th Air Force had changed. The raids were larger, the escort wings stronger. But the losses, those empty bunks, the untouched mugs in the mess hall, still measured the price of progress. When he stood before the briefing map again, the red lines across Germany seemed endless. Schweinfurt, Bremen, Kiel. Names that meant nothing to civilians and everything to the men who flew. Carr listened as the colonel spoke about strategic priorities and attrition ratios. None of it erased the memory of Reiner's voice fading into static. Historians would later call August 17th, 1943, the day daylight bombing proved possible. To the men who fought it, it was something else entirely, the day courage replaced arithmetic. In the winter that followed, the U.S. Army Air Forces expanded their escort strategy. The lessons written in contrails above Regensburg became doctrine. No more isolated squadrons beyond range. No more 8 against 60. When the new long-range drop tanks arrived in early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolts could finally escort bombers deep into Germany until the arrival of the P-51 Mustang took the mission even further, all the way to Berlin. The sky, once German territory, was no longer theirs. Yet inside the Luftwaffe, the shock lingered. Intercept reports from Jagdgeschwader 54 spoke of an American unit that fought with reckless coordination. Intelligence officers, puzzled, assumed the enemy had fielded a larger group. The idea that 8 fighters had held off 60 contradicted their sense of order. They filed it under statistical error. Carr stayed in Europe until the war's end. He flew 72 missions, earned the Distinguished Service Cross, and turned down promotion to remain with his squadron. But those who knew him said the laughter never came back fully. He wrote few letters. When he did, they were short, deliberate, like his radio calls over Regensburg. "We learned what air supremacy costs," he wrote to his wife. "Not just planes and fuel, it's men, and the faith that they'll hold when everything else breaks." After VE Day, he returned to Texas. The first time he walked into his family's ranch house, his mother mistook him for a stranger. The newspapers printed his story, a brief column between headlines about Berlin and the Pacific. But Carr never corrected or embellished it. When a reporter asked how 8 men could hold against 60, he simply said, "You don't count when you're fighting for time." 2 decades later, at an air show in 1963, an aging Carr stood beside a restored P-47 Thunderbolt, painted in the colors of the old 335th Squadron. Children clambered onto the wings. Veterans watched in silence. The announcer spoke of heroes of the 8th Air Force, but Carr's eyes were elsewhere, tracing the horizon where contrails once marked the edge of survival. He placed a hand on the fuselage and whispered, "It still flies true." No one heard him above the crowd. But for those who had been there, the few who still remembered the mission called Regensburg, the story had already become part of a larger truth. It wasn't about victory or defeat, but endurance, the fragile line between duty and death, drawn across the thin air of a foreign sky. In 1943, 8 American pilots faced 60 German fighters. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly forgotten. Yet the bombers they protected reached their targets, and the mission they held together helped tilt the air war toward freedom. History would remember the operation by its code name, not by the men who fought it, but among those who fly, their legacy endures in quieter ways, in the way pilots glance toward the sun before turning into combat, or the way crews still call their escorts angels on the wing. For in that sky of no return, courage had found its form, not in triumph, but in the simple act of holding the line when every calculation said it couldn't be held. And somewhere, above the fields of Bavaria, the echo of their engines still lingers, faint, steady, unbroken.